So there's an obvious question that might be popping into your head at this point. If Baten Kaitos is such a great game, if it really is a gem, as you keep insisting, why did it sell so poorly? I mean, the Gamecube wasn't exactly overflowing with great RPGs, so even though it didn't have the world's biggest install base, this game should still have been able to clear a cool million, right? The most critically acclaimed JRPG on the Gamecube was Paper Mario: The Thousand-Year Door, which ultimately sold almost 2 million copies, putting it among the top 20 best-selling Gamecube games of any kind. In fact, there are only 2 RPGs in the whole top 20, the other one being Pokémon Colosseum. But I don't think either of these games can be reasonably compared with Baten Kaitos. Both are similarly quirky and unusual, for sure, but they were also side entries in 2 of the most prominent and lucrative video game franchises of all time, Mario and Pokémon. You could easily argue that there was a captive audience for both of these games when they came out, something which is certainly not true for Baten Kaitos. We can get a much better frame of reference for Baten Kaitos' failure to live up to sales expectations by looking at a game which released in very similar circumstances, and which also happened to share the same publisher. Tales of Symphonia released in North America in July of 2004, about half a year before Baten Kaitos did, and even though it was technically the 5th entry in a 9-year-old series, it was the first of the Tales games to sell and review well outside of Asia. Heck, half of the games in the series up to that point hadn't even been released outside of Asia. But despite being a relative newcomer to the international scene, and being a GameCube exclusive in North America, just like Baten Kaitos, Tales of Symphonia was a financial success. It was nothing that would set the world on fire, but 1.5 million units in less than 5 years is pretty good. For comparison, Namco is reported to have set a lifetime sales goal of just 500,000 units for Baten Kaitos, and as far as I can tell, it ended up selling about 250,000, which is barely better than something like Fire Emblem Path of Radiance. Now, don't get me wrong, Path of Radiance is a good game, but it's also a very niche game, even among GameCube RPGs, and it was probably cheaper to make than most of its peers in the genre, which may explain why Nintendo was happy with its sales results, and Namco wasn't happy with Baten Kaitos's. I also imagine it had something to do with the fact that nobody in the mid-2000s really expected a Fire Emblem game to be a big international hit, while Baten Kaitos was being hyped as the career-defining magnum opus of the guy who wrote Chrono Trigger and the art director for Chrono Cross. Or it might have had something to do with the fact that the developer of Path of Radiance was the same one that a year earlier had made Paper Mario: The Thousand-Year Door, and in Nintendo's eyes they could do no wrong. Who can say? The point is that even though Baten Kaitos probably didn't lose money, it was a serious disappointment in the eyes of its publisher, and a symptom of the disturbing absence of popular interest and support which afflicted Monolith Soft almost from the day it was founded up to the release of Xenoblade Chronicles in 2010. When you look at the whole body of work that people like Masato Kato and Tetsuya Takahashi worked on, the downward trend leading up to Baten Kaitos is inescapably obvious. Sure, Xenosaga sold 1 million units for Monolith Soft by 2003, but Xenogears had already sold slightly more than that for Square. Chrono Cross sold 1.5 million units, and Chrono Trigger sold 2.5 million. Both Chrono Trigger and Final Fantasy VI sold 2 million units in Japan alone within 2 months. Final Fantasy VII, which, just as a reminder, Masato Kato did work on, sold that number of copies in 3 days. When you get right down to it, the crazy thing isn't that Baten Kaitos sold so few copies, it's that these other games sold so many. Theoretically, at least, every video game begins as a financial failure with 0 copies sold, and only gradually rises to the level of a success. No matter how good it is, or how fun, or whatever other appeal it has, people have to believe in its quality before they play in order to take the leap of buying it and investing time in it. So how do you get people to care about your game before it comes out? Well, one method which should spring to mind right away is to have it be a sequel or spiritual successor to a game that lots of people already love. Or in other words, use your reputation to sell the game. All of the big hits I mentioned a minute ago fall into this category except for Chrono Trigger. But even then, Squaresoft was able to use its company's reputation for making great games to promote it. When the original Final Fantasy sold 1 million copies in the NES back in the late 80s, that was solely due to it being a fantastic game. But every subsequent game in the series, as well as Square's other projects, was able to piggyback on that and build to even greater successes as a result. But Baten Kaitos' team didn't and probably couldn't take advantage of this strategy. Monolith Soft just didn't have enough of a track record, and nobody seemed to notice the connection that the team had to classic Squaresoft RPGs. At best, you might find a few reviews that suggested Baten Kaitos had a passing resemblance to Chrono Cross in its visuals, but even these tended to backhand Baten Kaitos by saying that its story wasn't up to the same standard. Probably because the second half of Baten Kaitos actually makes sense and doesn't sound like Chrono Trigger fanfiction written by Stephen King.
Boo!
Okay, I'm sorry. That was a low blow. I apologize. Anyway, so the mass market approach was out. What else was there? Well, by default, if you can't appeal to everyone who loves RPGs, then you have to go for a specific subgroup. This is what most RPGs have to do, since as big as the big names are, they don't produce the majority of games in this genre. It's also something that Tales of Symphonia managed to do in very similar circumstances. However, one thing that may have told in Tales of Symphonia's favor was that it was far more of a traditional JRPG than Baten Kaitos was. For all that contemporary critics dragged its story for being generic, Baten Kaitos is actually lacking in a lot of the classic fantasy elements that often undergird RPG stories. There's no summonable magic creatures, no fantasy races like elves or goblins, no fundamental conflict between magic and technology. In Final Fantasy, you heal yourself with sorceress potions and phoenix down. In Baten Kaitos, you heal with stuff like milk and strawberries, or outside of battle, wheat crackers and half-eaten shish kebabs. When people call this story generic, I think they really just mean that the story bores them. But I would guess that that's actually due more to the absence of popular fantasy cliches than their presence. Baten Kaitos is basically just about people, and it's much closer to low fantasy, like Harry Potter, than it is to a high fantasy epic like Lord of the Rings. Tales of Symphonia, on the other hand, sits firmly in the high fantasy camp. Both of these games have stories about saving the world, but in Tales of Symphonia, the world is this enormous multiverse, artificially split in two by a giant tree, that leads up to what is basically heaven. There's a church in both games, but in Baten Kaitos, this is just a place with undefined significance where you go to level up and look at the stars. In Tales of Symphonia, the church is the church, a social institution that dominates the world, and which all the major characters believe in to a greater or lesser extent. In Tales of Symphonia, there are summoned spirits. There are elves and goblins. In fact, fantasy racism is the core of the game's plot. And magic versus technology is a big deal, with the Church of Martel trying to control both. In Tales of Symphonia, you heal with gels and life bottles. It's all a lot more like Final Fantasy than Baten Kaitos ever tried to be. In fact, with its themes of sacrifice, war between humanity and a higher power, and the rejuvenation of an exhausted land, Tales of Symphonia's plot actually bears a striking resemblance to Final Fantasy X, which did not go unnoticed on its North American release. But whether or not you think riding another game's coattails like this is cheating, if your game is distinct enough to be memorable and also fun to play, this makes for a really good marketing strategy. People enjoy retreading old ground a lot more than they'll openly admit, and I think one of Tales of Symphonia's greatest assets is its ability to evoke the feeling of earlier RPGs while not directly ripping them off. It makes the game, what's the word? Comfy? Yeah, I think that's the word I'm looking for. Are you kind of starting to see why Baten Kaitos didn't have much of a chance to be a big hit? A lot of the things which I, and maybe a few thousand other people, really love about Baten Kaitos are the same things that made it a punching bag when it originally came out. The fact that it was so different aesthetically and emotionally wasn't a selling point. Players say they want variety and fresh ideas, but half the time when you offer that to them, they'll turn up their noses at it and go for something more polished, i.e. familiar. The card battle system? That was mocked mercilessly by players at the time. I've seen it compared to Kingdom Hearts' Chain of Memories, which has a totally different kind of combat, and yet because they both use cards, people assumed that they were the same thing. Even the visuals, the one aspect of Baten Kaitos that was almost universally praised by critics, could have hindered its success. These lavish pre-rendered backgrounds are wonderful to look at, but they put the emphasis on the background and not on the characters, which makes it harder to focus on drama and emotions. The cel-shaded graphics and relative lack of detail in games like Tales of Symphonia or even Dragon Quest VIII may be less sumptuous to look at. It makes Lloyd look like a hamster in half of the game's cutscenes. But because the graphics are simpler, they're also easier to understand and relate to. There's a reason that RPGs have almost never made cutting-edge visuals a priority. When your primary goal is to tell a complex story, at a certain point aesthetic detail actually distracts the player and gets in the way of that. But there is one way that Baten Kaitos could have become a surprise hit. It couldn't lean on Monolith Soft's non-existent reputation, it couldn't coast to victory by aping the design of older, successful games, and it couldn't hook the majority of RPG fans with its distinctly non-traditional approach to RPG stylings. But it could have ridden the same wave as, say, a lot of later entries in the Castlevania series, which had virtually no mass-market appeal, but were sustained by a hardcore of supportive fans and sympathetic critics. Okay, so we've already seen that the critics' opinions of Baten Kaitos were lukewarm at best, but what about that cult fan base? Surely they could at least get that. Well, they kind of half did. Baten Kaitos is sometimes described as a cult classic, but not in the same sense that, say, Earthbound is a cult classic. This description typically implies a small but dedicated fan base that spends years after the product's original release discussing it, making derivative works based on it, and continuing to remind the general public that it exists. Baten Kaitos does not have that kind of fan base, and never did. It's not even particularly easy to find prominent videos discussing the game on YouTube, a platform where you can get an audience for almost anything. The most popular videos on Baten Kaitos generally have less than 50,000 views. Even I am theoretically in a position to get more views by discussing this game than the vast majority of previous YouTubers who have covered it, and I don't even qualify for the YouTube Partner Program. Think about that. It's difficult to say why even this last chance at success, the possibility of attracting a cult following, was denied Baten Kaitos. But a video I watched just a few weeks ago gave me an inkling of an attitude shift that may have been at work during the game's release to keep serious JRPG fans from supporting it and wanting to give it a shot. Ironically, this disaffection likely emerged because of the previous commercial failure of a game with which it had quite a lot in common, the pirate-themed Dreamcast romp Skies of Arcadia, which came out several years before Baten Kaitos in late 2000. Like Baten Kaitos, Skies of Arcadia was a fun and creative game made by a team led by talented industry veterans. These were people who had worked on Panzer Dragoon and Phantasy Star. But unlike Baten Kaitos, Skies of Arcadia was showered with critical praise from almost every quarter for its exciting story, charming characters, and huge open world to explore. This was a game overflowing with personality, the kind of thing that would be destined to define an entire console generation, just like Chrono Trigger. Except for one little problem. It released on the Sega Dreamcast, the only 6th-generation console to sell even fewer units than the Nintendo Gamecube, and the final straw that broke Sega's back as a console manufacturer after years of failed products and crippling financial losses. Skies of Arcadia came out at almost exactly the same time that the PlayStation 2 released worldwide, and started kicking everybody's ass, but particularly Sega's, to the moon and back. While it seemed like everybody who bought Skies of Arcadia loved it, hardly anybody did buy it. This game never really stood a chance. And then, right at the beginning of 2003, it seemed like the game was getting its second wind. A slightly retooled port of Skies of Arcadia released for the Nintendo Gamecube, and fans' hopes that this would become a cultural phenomenon were kindled once again, only to be horribly dashed when the Gamecube version sold even worse than the original had. Despite minor adjustments, this was now a 3-year-old game, and most players just weren't interested. Not to mention that anyone who was really serious about RPGs during that generation was urged to buy a PS2 and stay far, far away from the GameCube. Despite its poor sales, Skies of Arcadia was a game with a cult following, and its fans had boundless faith in the game's merits, which was not reciprocated by the mass market. Naturally, they became a little bitter over it, and when these fans, many of them GameCube owners, saw a new game coming out set on islands in the sky, with the plot revolving around a quest to collect magical artifacts before an evil empire could gather them all and wreak havoc, my guess is they saw red. It's my suspicion that many of the people who might have been big fans of Baten Kaitos never even played it because they thought it was a rip-off of Skies of Arcadia, and they were still angry about what had happened to that game. When I looked through old forum posts comparing these two games, and there are quite a few of them, about 30% of the respondents had opinions ranging from Baten Kaitos is fantastic and Skies of Arcadia is just okay, to these games are both great but Baten Kaitos is a little better. Meanwhile, around 70% had opinions ranging from Skies of Arcadia is the one to play if you only play one, to Baten Kaitos sucks and Skies of Arcadia is the best game I've ever played. The sad truth is that a lot of people only really have room in their heart for a few works of fiction, especially if they're the kind of person who spends a lot of time thinking and talking about what they like. With the potential fanbase for Baten Kaitos split between people who believed the critics who said the game had a boring story and didn't look into the matter any further, people who liked RPGs but didn't like card games and refused to consider the difference between Baten Kaitos and something like Yu-Gi-Oh!, and people who liked the basic ideas behind Baten Kaitos but also thought that Skies of Arcadia had already done them better, it's honestly astounding that Baten Kaitos could even manage to outsell Skies of Arcadia. Hey, so this is future editor Noir here, if I could just interject for a moment. It turns out that Baten Kaitos didn't outsell Skies of Arcadia. I've looked into it a little bit more, and Skies of Arcadia actually sold a little more than 300,000 copies, from what I can tell. Baten Kaitos sold about 270,000 copies. So, sorry for that little piece of misinformation. Skies of Arcadia sold better. Anyway, back to the video. So that's the story of what happened to Baten Kaitos. In a lot of ways, it was just a game that happened to come out at the wrong time and under the wrong set of expectations. Masato Kato and Yasuyuki Hone expected potential players to look past the simple premise of Baten Kaitos to the complexity buried underneath. And they didn't. Namco expected, partly because of the surprise success of Tales of Symphonia, that Baten Kaitos could be a major property that would rival Final Fantasy, ignoring just how big that elephant in the room had really become, and how much people implicitly trusted Square Enix games to lead the pack. And players expected that any game which claimed the status of a cutting-edge current-gen RPG would feature cinema-quality cutscenes and top-shelf voice acting, the way that Final Fantasy X did. Not that the voice acting in Final Fantasy X is actually that great, but if I got into that argument, we'd be here all day. As the years have gone by, I think more people have come around to the idea that Baten Kaitos was a great and unique game, and that maybe it didn't deserve the critical paddling that it got at the time. There are very few people who care for it like I do, but I think the general opinion is closer to mine now than it was a few years after the game's release. I haven't seen any digital sales figures for the remaster yet, but it's reasonable to assume from reported physical sales and the low-key marketing effort from Bandai Namco that it isn't going to take the gaming world by storm. And to be honest, that's okay by me. It's enough to know that some people who grew to appreciate Baten Kaitos but never had a chance to play it before will now have an opportunity to see what all the lack of fuss is about. I think I'll leave you all on that mildly optimistic note and return you to your regularly scheduled video. Oh shoot, I forgot to talk about the sequel again. Jeez, where is my head today? Okay, so the other thing that happened to Baten Kaitos, oddly considering everything else, is that it got a sequel. Well, a prequel, actually. About 2 years after the original released in North America, Baten Kaitos Origins. Work on this prequel began almost immediately after the original Baten Kaitos was finished, but one major change was that Masato Kato would no longer be attached to the project as head writer, or anything else. Instead, the script would be written by a fresh-faced Monolith Soft employee named Ko Kojima, who was a virtual unknown back then. Incidentally, he is no longer an obscure figure at Monolith Soft. Kojima is the co-director of all 3 Xenoblade Chronicles games, and co-producer of the last 2. Just thought I'd throw that out there for context. Origins is obviously set in the same world as the original game, although there are several new areas which presumably existed then but just weren't visited by the party. Also, because it's set just 20 years before the events of Baten Kaitos, Origins features many familiar characters from its predecessor, which I have to say is one of my favorite things about it. Ko Kojima may not have written the original story, but he really nailed these characters' personalities, making Origins one of the few truly believable prequels I've experienced, not just in video games. The voice acting is also, mercifully, much improved, to the point that I've never heard anybody express unhappiness with it. The main party now consists of just 3 characters, so you hear them talking among themselves a lot, and it's nice that they have such pleasant and expressive voices to convey a script which many people consider superior to the originals. I think they're about even, myself. But if I keep forgetting to mention Baten Kaitos Origins, that might have something to do with the fact that apart from the story and the aesthetics, I dislike practically all the changes that the team made to this game. The watchword for Origins design is streamlining in just about every aspect of the game. The variety of cards is considerably reduced, and combat is simplified to be less about deck construction, all the characters now share one deck anyway, and more about making smart combo decisions on the fly. The number system is also pared down to 1s, 2s, and 3s. Rather than forming straight and pair combos, in Origins you build up to finishers that can sometimes be strung together in order to continue the attack. It's actually faintly reminiscent of the system from Chrono Cross, and feels quite different from the original's design. But this has never been a combat system I've really enjoyed. Maybe I'm just too attached to the original's setup, but when I played through Origins, I found it much more difficult, despite the deliberate simplification of your options in battle. Origins kind of softens this by healing your party after each battle is over, so that combat is purely a short-term concern, and you don't have to worry about being wiped by a scrub enemy just because you ran out of healing items. But to be honest, I don't really like this change either. It's practical, and it keeps the game from feeling too brutal, but it also feels kind of contrived, and, I don't know, somehow makes each area feel less integrated to me, since the slate is wiped clean every time you eliminate a group of enemies. It also means that bosses are much more of a difficulty spike than they were previously, and in my opinion, this is not a good thing, because some of them are just unfair. The most infamous example, to anyone who's played this game, is the Hollow Bird, a meat grinder of a fight that you're thrown into just after you switch to the second disc. You could call this a kind of tradition, since the first game did something similar on the battleship Goldoba with Giacomo and his underlings, but that fight was nothing compared to the Hollow Bird. This thing is pure evil, and not in a fun way. It's like the Kaizo Mario version of a boss fight. There's also lots of other little things in this game that I just don't like very much. Side quests, enemy designs, level designs. None of it is bad, it's just not to my taste, at least not nearly as much as the first game was. I'm also not a fan of the new, non-returning characters, with the exception of the party members and a few others like Quaestor Varus and especially Shanath, a delightfully creepy underling of main villain Lord Balehite, who reminds me quite a bit of the Beetle from Sweeney Todd. One of the funniest things about Baten Kaitos Origins to me is how much it feels like it was made for hardcore fans of the original, who, based on that game's sales, would be a tiny fraction of the overall market for RPGs. There are numerous people who consider Origins to be the quintessential Baten Kaitos game, and the original to be a kind of proof of concept. But I'd be willing to bet more players of the original were turned off by the changes and the unexpected difficulty hike. Origins sold a miserable 100,000 copies, less than half of the original's already disappointing sales. This can partly be attributed to its coming out at the very tail end of the GameCube's life, but if you look at the critical response to Origins, you can also see that there just wasn't nearly as much enthusiasm for it. Trying to appeal to hardcore gamers in the second installment of a franchise which didn't really attract hardcore gamers to begin with isn't exactly a recipe for success. I'm very glad that Baten Kaitos Origins exists, but it's almost entirely because I get such a kick out of its story and the relationships established between characters appearing in the original Baten Kaitos. It doesn't have that simple pick-up-and-play appeal that the diverse, unstreamlined combat of its predecessor kept me hooked with for 50 hours. And honestly, it didn't come as any great surprise to me when Origins flopped and put the final nail in the coffin for this franchise. Just as a final footnote, one interesting curiosity about this game is that it was published by Nintendo, while the original Baten Kaitos had been published by Namco. The reason for this was that by 2006, Nintendo had essentially supplanted Namco as the major shareholder of Monolith Soft, and the primary commissioner of game projects from it. Nintendo rarely took over outside game studios wholesale like this, and the subsequent history of Monolith as a subsidiary of Nintendo for the next half-decade serves as a good indication of why they usually avoided doing that. Similarly to how Rare floundered after its acquisition by Microsoft, Monolith had a great deal of trouble coming up with a hit after Nintendo took over responsibility for its work. Their first game for the Wii, Disaster Day of Crisis, was so terrible that Reggie Fils-Aimé wouldn't even allow it to be released in North America. Now that's shocking. He didn't have a problem with Metroid Prime Federation Force coming to America, but this is where he drew the line? Ooh. Luckily for Monolith, it was around this same time that they began work on the series that would eventually drag them out of the quagmire, Xenoblade Chronicles. But my personal favorite member of the Baten Kaitos team, Masato Kato, wouldn't be involved with any of those games, just as he had avoided working on Xenogears and Xenosaga back in the day. Instead, he went back to Square Enix to work on the Mana series, and after those games had middling success, he essentially drifted away into the background of the Japanese RPG market, just as he had years before after the release of Chrono Cross. And then, out of nowhere, in 2017 he teamed up with Yasunori Mitsuda, best known for composing the music to, you guessed it, Chrono Cross, to write the story for a mobile game called Another Eden, which I've heard described like this: slow to get started, great story, deep combat system, fun characters, and in at least one case, criminally underrated. I guess it's true what they say, you can't keep a good man down. I wonder what he's working on now.